Well, these protests, which really have degenerated rather badly yesterday, are really at the heart of what's going on in New Caledonia at the moment, which is an independence referendum process. New Caledonia is quite important for Australia. It's, in part of that geostrategic arc to our northeast. It's like a buffer state to the rest of the world. And it also straddles our major sea lanes. So what happens there is quite important for Australia. And we haven't really had to think too much about what's been going on there for the last 30 years because there have been peace agreements that France has brokered with leaders of political parties who both want to stay with France and those who want to actually become independent. And at the core of the independence leaders' demands is, in fact, what happens to the nickel resource. Nickel is New Caledonia's major resource. It's something like 12% of the world's resources in nickel reside there. And it's certainly enough to fund an independent government, certainly enough to fund an independent country.
So how does the controversy over the ownership of the mine play into these issues with independence that you're talking about here?
Well, at core is really the participation and ownership of the benefits and the production of the major nickel resource. The world nickel market is quite volatile, and there have been a lot of problems in the production of nickel and the pricing of nickel in the last few years. Part of the peace agreements that France brokered with the different political parties in the 1980s was what's known as the mining prerequisite, which is that basically the revenue and the production of nickel should be shared more throughout New Caledonia between the Kanak North and the European South. Two big plants were invested in, major multi-billion-dollar nickel producing plants, including the one in the south, which has been the subject of these protests yesterday. About a year ago, the multinational owner, Vale Brazil, decided that they wanted to pull out. The prices have been bad, there's been volatility, technical problems. An Australian company made an offer in July, but they pulled out just before the second referendum in October this year because the independence leaders said they didn't want a uniquely foreign-owned plant. They wanted a greater share for the New Caledonian people. Subsequently, Vale has been in negotiations with a company, a Swiss investor, but the local Indigenous leaders decided that they came up with a proposition that involved a Korean company. By Thursday, Vale Brazil decided to sign on with the Swiss company, and that's been the immediate precipitator of this protest movement yesterday, which degenerated into violence and, in fact, shooting throughout the day.
And Denise, where does it leave negotiations now, and what are protesters demanding?
The protesters are demanding greater local New Caledonian participation in the ownership and production of the nickel resource. So the kinds of proposals that they've put forward have involved at least 51% ownership by New Caledonian interests. Most of their projects, of course, have involved the northern province, which is the primarily Kanak part of New Caledonia. So that loyalists who are mainly located in the south have said, no, you're just trying to take over our southern plant, when the main point the independence leaders are making is that they want greater New Caledonian participation. So a lot of it is about establishing ambit claims, because it's a critical time now for all leaders to get around the table and start discussing what happens, indeed, after the third referendum, which will be in 2022. What will the shape of New Caledonia be after that? The French government has been trying to broker roundtable discussions, which have been fraught with difficulty, with various parties withdrawing over the last couple of years. But finally, last night, the Minister for Overseas Territories in France has invited everybody to come to Paris to talk not about just Goro, this particular processing plant that was the subject of yesterday's disturbances, but also about the overall share of New Caledonians in all of the mines in New Caledonia, and all of the production, talking about environmental regulations, a number of the general issues that the independence leaders have wanted to be at the top of the agenda.
And how do you think this might play out? What's the feeling on the ground as well?
I think that if everyone can agree to sit around the table and start discussing these issues, the best we can hope for is that collaboration will produce agreement. Sadly, the history of New Caledonia around nickel has not been very promising up till now. Over the 30 years of the peace agreements, there have been promises of a strategic review of the entire nickel resource, the entire nickel program for New Caledonia, urged by the independence movement leaders. These have come to nothing over 30 years. So there's a lot of lack of legitimacy and credibility on the part of the independence leaders. And for the loyalists' part, there's a lot of concern and really fear after the results of the referendum. You know, the constant increasing in support for independence has worried a lot of the loyalist leaders, and they really feel that they're in an increasingly powerless position. So I think all hopes now lie with the negotiating and mediating capacities of the French state, as has been so often the case in the past, to get all the parties around the table and to be able to secure agreement, peaceful agreement about the way forward.
Denise, thanks so much for talking to us.
It's a pleasure.